There has been a lot of discussion around the near miss between an Alaska flight and a FedEx flight on arrival at Newark Airport. And like most highly visible situations, there are a range of interpretations of what actually occurred. As a retired 22-year air traffic controller with experience working both radar and tower at some of the country's busiest facilities, I want to walk you through what likely happened here, the procedures involved, and how this situation developed operationally. Before I begin, if you want to see the full replay of this event with audio, I suggest you check out VAS Aviation. They have the full replay, and the link is in the description below. This event starts well before both aircraft reach the airport. An extremely busy approach controller is sequencing arrivals to both Newark Airport and Teterboro Airport, with the RNAV 29 and ILS runway 22 left approaches in use at Newark Airport. FedEx 721 is actually being set up for the RNAV to runway 29, while Alaska 294 is expecting the ILS to runway 22 left. At this point, the aircraft are about 5 miles apart, with FedEx 721 approximately 1,100 feet below Alaska 294. From a weight turbulence standpoint, these aircraft fall into different categories, and standard separation typically involves a combination of radar spacing and vertical separation requirements. However, controllers can apply reduced separation using visual separation procedures when conditions permit. In this case, the controller issued traffic to Alaska 294 and then instructed Alaska 294 to maintain visual separation from FedEx 721. A wake turbulence advisory, or a caution wake turbulence, was also issued as required since FedEx 721 is a heavy category aircraft. This is an example of pilot-applied visual separation where responsibility for maintaining separation is transferred from the controller to the pilot once that pilot has the aircraft in sight and is instructed to do so. Additionally, the approach controller requested Alaska 294 to reduce to final approach speed prior to having them contact the tower. This is an important detail as it suggests the controller was actively managing the closure rate, anticipating that the spacing at the airport would be tight. For context, the RNAV approach to runway 29 FedEx 721 is flying is an offset from runway 22 left, tracking roughly parallel before turning and aligning with runway 29 during the visual segment of the approach. Now, when Alaska 294 checks in with the tower controller again instructs them to reduce to final approach speed, reinforcing the need to manage spacing. At this point, Alaska 294 is about 1.5 miles behind FedEx 721, with FedEx 721 still needing to complete the turn to final for runway 29er, crossing in front of Alaska 294's approach path into runway 22 left. Here's where things get tight. FedEx 721 is established on final for runway 29er about 1 mile ahead of Alaska 294 and roughly 300 feet below. From an operational standpoint, the tower controller should be closely evaluating whether the sequence will work or whether alternate control instruction, like a go-around, will be required. Another important factor to consider is wind. Winds at Newark were reported out of the west around 260 degrees, 14 knots, gusting to 22 knots. So in other words, 260 at 1/4, gusting to 22. As FedEx 721 turns into the stronger headwind component on final, the aircraft is likely to reduce its ground speed, which can compress spacing even further. Under FAA procedures for intersecting runway operations, controllers in Newark must ensure that the arriving runway 29er aircraft is clear of the runway 22 left intersection prior to the runway 22 left landing traffic reaching the threshold of runway 22 left. The sequence here suggests the expectation was that FedEx 721 would clear the critical area in time. However, as the geometry tightened, approximately 1/2 mile converging and about 200 feet vertical separation, the tower controller issued a go-around to Alaska 294. Was this operation consistent with standard procedures? Based on what we know, it appears to be consistent with established intersecting runway and visual separation operations. These procedures are routinely used at Newark to increase arrival efficiency and throughput, allowing aircraft to land on different runways without occupying the same pavement thus reducing the amount of airborne spacing required. From a judgment standpoint, this developed into a very tight situation. An earlier go-around may have reduced compression and avoided a last-second maneuver by the Alaska aircraft. Here's a very important point. This was a controlled operation. All parties involved, the approach controller, tower controller, both flight crews, were aware of the situation as it developed. This was not a breakdown in communication or loss of situational awareness. In an operation like this with multiple layers, including controller monitoring, pilot applied visual separation, and the ability to intervene at any time, the system is designed to prevent loss of safety margins. In this case, the system ultimately worked. The go-around was the intervention issued here that ensured separation was maintained. However, this situation developed to a point where the instruction probably came a bit late. From an operational standpoint, this appears to be a judgment issue. Recognizing this earlier, that the sequence was no longer going to work, and acting sooner would have prevented the aircraft from being as close to one another as they were. That distinction is extremely important. The safety net functioned as designed, but earlier recognition and decision-making likely would have resulted in a more stable and predictable outcome. Based on experience, when all participants understand the operation and are actively engaged, the system provides multiple opportunities to correct the situations before it becomes unsafe. Some may ask why the approach controller didn't simply put both aircraft on the same runway with the additional spacing. The answer comes down to efficiency and capacity. Using both runway 22 left and runway 29er in this manner increases the arrival rate and reduces delays, thus providing operational flexibility. Not using both runways can cause delays to cascade through the entire national airspace system, resulting in misconnections and passengers missing important events. This operation is a standard procedure at Newark and is conducted safely on a routine basis. Controllers are trained to run aircraft this tight, and if they can't, many times they are not certified to do so on their own. To sum it all up, this was a high workload, tightly sequenced operation that developed to the edge of acceptable spacing. The tower controller made a late but effective decision to send Alaska 294 around. There are definitely lessons to be learned here, particularly around anticipated compression due to wind or closure rate, but this was not an uncontrolled situation. It was a dynamic operation managed in real time, with the system ultimately doing what it's designed to do. That's it for this week. Follow for more air traffic control and aviation content, and we'll see you next time right here on Normal Freaks.